speaking with a Jehovah's Witness or someone else who denies the full divinity of Christ, a very useful verse to appeal to is Philippians 2:6, in which Paul writes of Jesus having the form of God. In my preferred translation, the NASB, here's what Philippians 2:5 and 6 has to say. Have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped. In the Jehovah's Witness translation, the New World Translation, which is not always trustworthy, in this case, it actually does say something very similar. So let's read it in that translation. Keep this mental attitude in yourself that was also in Christ Jesus, who, although he was existing in God's form, gave no consideration to a seizure, namely that he should be equal to God. Notice that both of those passages speak of Jesus having the form of God. Now, if you already believe in the divinity of Christ, this may seem like an open and shut case to you. After all, it says Jesus was God. What's there to question? What's there to debate? But if you don't believe in the divinity of Christ, often what the person will say is, well, it says in the form of God. And this is where sometimes having English translations of what the original authors actually wrote can be a little bit unhelpful, a little bit confusing, because sometimes the words that are used to translate don't capture the full meaning, the full nuance of what was originally written in Greek or in the Old Testament in Hebrew. And in this case, the word form is actually unhelpful. In English, we can say that somebody has the form of something when we mean, the appearance. So we might say that a statue has the form of a man. And in that case, if we say that Jesus had the form of God, well, that might mean something like he sort of looked like God, he was a godlike creature, something like that, which is more or less what a Jehovah's Witness actually believes. But, as both Christians and Jehovah's Witnesses agree, it's important that we go back to the original language to see what the apostles actually wrote when they were recording initially the books that are now our New Testament. And if we look back at the word that Paul used when he said that Jesus had the form of God, we find that that word is Morphe, M-O-R-P-H-E, Morphe. And that particular word, it's important that we recognize that it's speaking of something almost exactly the opposite of the external appearance. The word morphe speaks to essence, nature, what a thing actually is. So it's actually the exact opposite of like a statue having the form of a man. The statue in English, we might say, has the form of a man. But you would never say that a statue has the morphe of a man, because it doesn't have a man's nature. It looks like a man, but it's not. Whereas morphe says the nature, the essence, what it is. So what Paul is saying here is that Christ had the morphe of God. That is to say, Christ had the very essence, the very being of God within himself. In fact, even the verb which Paul uses here, we typically translated it in English translations just something like, Christ was in the form of. But it's actually a very emphatic verb in the original Greek. Paul really wants to drive home the point that Christ was in the very nature, the very essence of God himself. And of course, Paul, in context of Philippians 2, is using that to make the point that just like Christ humbled himself from that place of being God himself in heaven, he put aside his dignity, his rights, and came in the form of a bondservant, Paul writes. And Paul calls us to similarly humble ourselves. That is Paul's point here. But in service of that point, he makes a very important observation, which is that the inspired apostle of God, Paul, declares that Jesus Christ was, and of course continues to be, of the very nature, the same nature of God the Father. And even though he put aside some of his glory temporarily to appear on earth as a man, yet he remains God. And if we are to worship him and honor him rightly, that means we need to worship him as very God of very God. He does indeed have the Morphe of God.